The original entries in the Castlevania series have often been described as stiff, clunky, and frustrating by modern players. Although the hardware limitations of the 80s did impose some restrictions on the player character movement, the rigidity of Castlevania stands out even among its classic action-era siblings. While games like Super Mario Bros., Metroid, Mega Man, Contra, and Ninja Gaiden allowed for varying degrees of mid-air correction and reactive movement, Castlevania centered its entire design around commitment and predictive movement. Its core gameplay shares much of its DNA with the original Ghosts and Goblins, while still feeling distinct from it. In this video, I'd like to take a closer look at the movement and mechanics of classic Castlevania, how it compares to other games of the same era, and what modern games can still learn from its reductionist design. To understand why Castlevania feels so unusual, it's important to first analyze the movement itself. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be much that differs from other side-scroller NES games. Movement left and right is handled by the directional inputs, with jumping mapped to one of the action buttons. Up and down are reserved for interacting with staircases, while the secondary action button is used for attacking. Pressing up and attack simultaneously uses a sub-weapon, provided Simon has one equipped and sufficient hearts, which, unintuitively, act as mana in this game. The details lie in how each mechanic is implemented. Once a jump is initiated, Simon is locked into a fixed arc that can be cancelled, adjusted, or reversed mid-air. Regardless of how long the jump input is held, the arc will cover the same height and distance each time. Attacks can only face the direction Simon is jumping towards. That includes both the whip and sub-weapons. On a technical level, the attack animation takes a total of 23 frames, or 22 while airborne. The hitbox becomes active only on frame 17, so for the better part of the animation, Simon is stationary and vulnerable. The whip and sub-weapons wind-up animations incentivize the player to plan their attacks in advance and choose their timings deliberately. If an enemy closes distance too quickly, it is entirely possible that Simon will take damage before the whip connects with the enemy. If the player finds themselves in a context like this, they can use a backward jump to create distance between the enemy and Simon. However, this requires pressing the opposite direction that Simon is facing and the jump button on the same frame, so the execution and quick thinking prevent it from becoming an abusable strategy. It also introduces additional risk, since retreating blindly can throw Simon directly into enemies coming behind him. Since walking has the same movement speed as jumping, it naturally becomes the safer and more controlled option in most situations. Jumping haphazardly without consideration for incoming projectiles or enemies rushing from off-screen can result in unavoidable damage if Simon is already committed to his arc. Simon has a decent amount of health, being able to withstand about 8 attacks from regular enemies. But in the same vein as other NES games, pitfalls are going to be the #1 cause of deaths for most new players. Contact with an enemy while stationary, walking, or jumping into it results in a knockback that covers roughly 2/3 of Simon's jump distance. Staircases cannot be interacted with while in mid-air, so knockback animation near them is just as dangerous as near a pit, resulting in an instant death. Outside of acting as a possible pitfall, stairs introduce an additional layer of constraint. Starting ascent or descent on a staircase triggers a transition animation, whose length depends on how far away Simon is from the first step. During this window, Simon is fully vulnerable and cannot attack until the animation finishes. This forces the player to consider both enemy placement and whether they have enough time to initiate an attack or get away from the enemy hitbox in time. Because of these short but frequent commitment windows, the game can initially feel unresponsive. But instead of looking at it as the game feels restrictive, Simon's movement limitations make a lot more sense when you realize that the entire game is built around the system he operates on. The same Medusa heads that will make you shout at the screen have a fixed wave-like pattern, following a consistent trajectory that can be learned and anticipated. The wind-up animations, recovery frames and lack of character momentum create a rigid but predictable movement system. The game functions similar to a ticking clock. Every element follows a steady cadence and flow. Once you learn an enemy's jig, suddenly the game feels like you're in tune with its internal rhythm. In isolation, these design choices already define a bold and rigid system, but when compared to other games of the same era, Castlevania's unique identity really starts to stand out. Of all the games mentioned earlier, it sits almost at the opposite end of the movement spectrum from Contra. Contra's gameplay is designed around constant adaptation. The main form of attack for both enemies and the player character is projectiles. Combined with the fast movement speed and dancing counter design, this encourages the player to react quickly and improvise in the moment. Compared to Simon, Bill, the player character, has near complete freedom of movement while airborne, allowing him to instantly correct his positioning mid-jump with very little sense of momentum or commitment. I say near complete because, like Simon, the height of the jump is fixed, so there is still some consideration required before jumping. Projectiles are fired almost the moment the input is registered, with hitboxes becoming active instantly. Combined with the 8-directional shooting, positioning in Contra is dictated less by long-term planning and more by rapidly responding to incoming enemy fire. In a similar manner, Ninja Gaiden also allows for mid-air movement correction, but in a slightly more limited form. Ryu's jump height is once again fixed, but he can stop his momentum mid-jump and slightly reposition himself. Compared to Contra, which lacks any horizontal momentum, Ninja Gaiden introduces a more constrained system, where the player must account for how much adjustment is actually possible before committing to a jump. This is also conveyed through the level design, with narrow platforms that often require tight positioning. Ryu's attack is much faster than Simon's, but is also the shortest of the games mentioned. His wind-up attack animation seems to take about 1 or 2 frames before the hitbox becomes active, so a small degree of spacing is still required to avoid contact damage with enemies. Metroid offers slightly more movement freedom. Samus's jump height is determined by how long the jump input is held. Similar to Ryu, she also carries a degree of horizontal momentum in mid-air and is free to change her attack direction at any time. Her basic attack is a short-range projectile which resembles Simon's whip range. Unlike Contra, attacks are 3-directional, so both enemy and player character positioning are crucial. Mega Man sits in a weird place, because while there is a small degree of on-ground momentum, the mid-air one is almost inexistent. Like Samus, jump height is variable depending on input duration, but Mega Man can change direction mid-air more freely. The ability to grab ladders while airborne and the fact that falling off-screen does not result in instant death incentivize jumping and vertical traversal. However, the bi-directional attack system places it closer to Castlevania in level design than to a game like Contra, where offensive coverage is far more flexible. Super Mario Bros. Is the least actiony of these, and the movement system reflects that. Mario's ground and mid-air momentum play a major role in the level design and enemy encounters. His base form lacks any attack options outside of jumping on enemies. The momentum and acceleration systems allow for both reactive gameplay on subsequent playthroughs and more deliberate planning on a first run. Looking across these side-scroller classic games and their movement systems, there always seems to be a trade-off between movement, player character attacks, and enemy pressure. Contra allows for complete aerial control and 8-directional shooting, but the enemy density balances them. Mega Man gives the player more mid-air freedom, but limits the player character's attacks to only 2 directions. Ryu's attack hitbox becomes active almost instantly, but the short range forces the player to pay attention to enemy positioning. All of this is to say that Castlevania seems to take all the limitations from each game and throw them all in one place. Simon's attack animation takes obscenely long compared to the other games. His attacks are only bi-directional. His jump arc is fixed, he lacks any sort of ground or air movement correction, and the level design is extremely punishing with its pitfalls. Even compared to Ghosts and Goblins, with whom it shares most of its traits, At the very least, that game allows for changing attack direction mid-air. But that's what makes it such an interesting game. Even though it limits the player in so many ways, the level design, predictable enemies, and clockwork-like rhythm all give the player enough room to focus more on planning their moves rather than reacting in the moment. Nowadays, a design like that will be quite controversial, but it does remind me of a very popular series that's praised by its fans. I think it has something to do with long wind-up animations, punishing falls, recovery frames, enemy spacing, and commitment to one's actions. Wonder which one it was. While Dark Souls preserved a lot of Castlevania's DNA with its focus on punishment and commitment, I think looking at 2D games is a better comparison. Modern games rely a lot more on smoothness and fluidity, both because smoother animation is visually appealing, but also because gameplay-wise it generally feels better to have those in-between frames that make the game seem more polished. However, that's not to say that it comes at no cost. Incorporating more wind-up and recovery animations has to be done thoughtfully in regards to player acceleration, momentum, inertia, and weight. If there is a discrepancy between the actual movement and how it's being conveyed, that can break the immersion. Let's take the original Hollow Knight and Silksong as a comparison. Compared to the Knight, whose turn animation is extremely brief, Hornet's contains significantly more transitional frames. Logically, you'd think she has more weight than the Knight and that she turns slower, but in actuality, they are both weightless. Neither the Knight nor Hornet have any sort of horizontal momentum. The game simply tries to simulate it through its animations. Silksong undeniably looks much more polished, but the original Hollow Knight's simpler animation language arguably communicates its movement system more faithfully. While less visually appealing, in my opinion, it sits more in line with what's actually happening internally. Looking at both games' mid-air turning animations, we can see how they happen instantly. This trade-off between visual and mechanical output doesn't have to be discrepant. Celeste, Super Meat Boy, and Dust Force feature much more mechanically complex systems, while still conveying them visually with clarity and precision. Castlevania's own evolution away from its classic side-scroller games to the exploration platformer genre was marked by Symphony of the Night. The transition from the very rigid movement system to the much more fluid, almost dreamlike flow that Alucard has when moving was congruent with his character thematically, visually, and mechanically. In classic Castlevania, if Simon was vulnerable, he looked vulnerable. If he was committed to a jump, he looked committed. If he was locked into recovery frames and unable to turn, the game reflected it visually. Modern games gained fluidity and much more expressive movement, but in many cases lost mechanical clarity and commitment. There are certainly things that were a product of their time and should probably stay like that. Sprite flickering and severe slowdowns were simply consequences of hardware limitations. Ghosts and Goblins control scheme will be called broken nowadays, because the player character was unable to initiate movement unless the down button was fully released before pressing another one. Limited continuous and full game restarts were very much relics of the arcade era, where games had to be made as difficult as possible so that players will keep churning coins into arcade cabinets. Castlevania itself is no stranger to this sort of artificial difficulty. Normally, if Simon jumps towards an enemy, he's supposed to be knocked backwards, but on certain platforming sections, if Simon jumps towards a Medusa head, instead of being knocked back horizontally, he'll be displaced downwards, making those sections even more unforgiving. While many of these traits are clearly tied to the constraints and design philosophies of their time, their gradual removal naturally led to a change in how movement, punishment, and clarity are handled in modern games. But something might have been lost along the way. The strict alignment between animation and mechanics, that is, the sense that every action is fully committed, readable, and consequential, became less common. In older systems like classic Castlevania, movement was something the game clearly expressed back to you at every step. It was a kind of mechanical clarity and intentionality that gave meaning to every action. Modern games are a bit more accessible to parse and are often more comfortable to control. What makes Castlevania such an interesting game to me is not how difficult it is, but that it creates a very specific relationship between the player, their input, and the game's output. A type of relationship where its movement and mechanics have to be put at the forefront of a playthrough.